Hi there, I'm Beth and I'm back with another sewing tutorial to share with you all. I've been working on a more elevated version of my previous mannequin style, this time for the new Smart Doll guys. As with my previous dress forms, I started by wrapping the doll in cling film and applying masking tape where I want to draw my pattern shapes. I was very careful to include registration marks and really tried to make the arms and legs and crotch as simple as I could. I carefully cut the masking tape away from the doll and cut along all of the seam lines. I went ahead and used these pieces to make my first mock-up of my manly mannequin. I was really quite happy with this and was delighted to find all of his measurements matched the original doll once stuffed. So I've gone ahead and digitized my pattern pieces, printed them at 100% scale, and because my printer paper is really thin, I'm going to glue my pattern to light cardboard before cutting out all the template pieces. These are all the pieces we will need, and broadly speaking this is how they go together. So obviously this is all the left hand side of the doll. The pieces for the arms and for the leg are marked L for left, and all of the pieces that need two copies should be mirrored for their second copy for the right side of the doll, and we're going to trace all of these onto the wrong side of the fabric so that we can see the seam lines as we're sewing. We're going to have the chest and front pieces, they attach to the crotch. This side seam attaches to this side seam, and then this at the side back and back will join together along here, and then everything will be mirrored to the back, to the front. The neck will attach to this seam up here and this seam here, and the leg looks a little confusing, but it will be turned into a tube like this, and then we'll see we have the side seam, and that is going to align here. So it's going to create the upper part of the leg, and this side seam will line up with this side seam in the end. Also potentially confusing is this seam here makes up the leg, and this is going to come right round, crotch to crotch, butt to butt, like so. So this is going to be the leg hole that's created. And likewise for the arms, marked left, these three pieces come together to create the shape of the arm, and these darts join to create the upper curve of the arm as well, and that's going to go into, well, this will be joined, but this is going to be our armhole. So first we're going to trace everything onto fabric, leaving a little space around, and we're going to add on our desired seam allowance, which could be 5mm or 7mm, whatever you're comfortable working with, and make sure that for all of the pieces you transfer these little markings, because they're really going to help matching pieces together when you get them in 3 dimensions. Okay, so they're going to match, they're going to match, they're going to match, and it's going to be a lot easier. And we trace our darts as well as we go, and I'll go and do that. Again, for the alignment of our pattern pieces on the fabric, which I have chosen to be a medium weight cotton. So this is definitely not quilting cotton, it's heavier than that. This is actually a curtain lining fabric that I have a lot of from my old curtain making job, and it's just not as flimsy. It will have a little stretch on the bias, so make sure you're not placing pieces diagonal because that'll have them stretch in unexpected ways. But for the arms, align sort of the grain of the fabric with the straight lower edge for all your arm pieces. Same with the leg. I've got it upside down here, but just have that on a grain that's not going to stretch, so it could be that way or it could be that way. And for these discs, it doesn't really matter, they're just round. For the crotch, I have the front center, this part at the front is aligned up and down. And again, broadly speaking, these long slim pieces, just going sort of straight along the grain, this one straight along the grain, straight along the grain, just so that we don't have any unwanted stretching up and down or left and right. When you stuff the mannequin at the end, you don't want it to be losing its shape and pushing out in weird places. So we're keeping everything straight, and obviously everything will be doubled, and I'm going to draw seam allowance around everything. We want our mannequin to come out as accurate in size as possible using these alignment marks. To help me mark them on the mirrored template pieces, I cut a little notch in my pattern and then mark them clearly with pen on the back side of the template. Again, to help maintain a really accurate pattern, I've eliminated seam allowance from the templates. On the fabric, I've traced around the template, included the alignment marks, and will now show you a couple different methods of adding in your seam allowance. You might have a little sliding ruler like this. Simply select the width of your desired seam allowance and use the pointed tips to help plot and fill in your seam allowance line using a heat erasable marker. Another method is to use a quilting ruler with lines which are the width you want for your seam allowance. Hold the inner ruler line against the edge of your outline, then plot and draw in your seam allowance line along the ruler's edge. I'm opting for a 5mm seam allowance for this project. Here are all of my pattern pieces drawn out onto the wrong side of my fabric. They fit into roughly a ½ meter square. The only pieces I haven't drawn out yet are these circles, which I'll save for later. I've cut out all my pieces and laid them roughly into order, being careful to mark each piece with either an L or an R so that I don't accidentally swap any pieces over, which I recommend. You'll notice for all of the darts, I have simply continued the seam allowance across the opening without cutting into them. To begin assembly, I start with the chest pieces, folding right sides in and hand stitching the small darts. I then cut small snips into the seam allowance of each of the front and side front pieces to allow them to flex and bend more easily to match up. I didn't cut right where my alignment marks are, but rather to either side, so I could still get my pin right at the junction of that line accurately. I align these two markings in the middle, then the ends of each seam. I add a few pins in between, and then stitch along the seam. If you find it difficult to sew any two pieces together because of your pins, consider temporarily baste stitching them with a running stitch instead before taking it to the sewing machine. Once the front and side front pieces are joined, attach the chest piece on top and repeat for the other side. Here they're all joined and we're ready to attach the crotch to the bottom of the front piece. Simply align right sides in and pin either end of the seam before stitching. We'll lay these front pieces aside for now. Next, we're going to join together the side back and back pieces for both the left and right side. Again, I recommend cutting lots of little snips into the seam allowance, leaving the alignment marks free to pin through. And because there's quite an extreme curve at the top, you may want to baste stitch the seam before stitching at the machine. For me, I like to keep the back piece facing down at the machine, so I'm able to lift and rotate everything around the needle with the curve oriented upwards. Here's how the piece should look once joined, and I just finger press the seam allowance facing up and towards the back. Finish both the left and right pieces by stitching the darts here at the butt. The darts are stitched, and these pieces can be put aside, keeping them sorted in their correct sides. Next, I move on to the arms, which once more have quite a curved seam, so I cut snips and add lots of pins before stitching the three main pieces together. Once they're joined, I like to go back and hand stitch each of the darts around the shoulder. Once all the darts are complete, I finger press the seam allowance outward and overlock stitch the lower hem of each arm. While I'm at it, I also overlock the lower edge of each leg piece and also the upper edge of the neck piece. Next, we'll join the front and back pieces at the shoulder seams. Again, I align and pin each end of the seam before stitching. Once joined at the shoulder, I align the front center seam all the way from the neckline to the end of the crotch. As I pin, I'm folding the seam allowance of the chest upward and the seam allowance at the crotch downward. At this point, with our shoulder seams finger pressed towards the back and lots of little cuts in the allowance, we can align and attach the neck piece. Again, I'm sparing no pins and I'm making sure my seams are as accurately matched up as possible. Next, we can attach the arms, being careful to match the left to the left and the right to the right, because they're not symmetrical. You'll find that each of the darts and seams should match up with an alignment marking as you pin them into place. Once both arms are stitched on, just like when we're making clothing, we can fold right sides together and close in the side seams. I push the armpit seam allowance downward and stitch from arm to hip, repeating for the other side. With the seam allowance pushed up for the neck and pushed down for the butt, I align each point along the centre back seam and pin before stitching. I transfer my stand port markings to the outer fabric side so I can still see them once it's stuffed. Stop sewing at this point along the back so that the butt end of the crotch can be joined afterwards. The back centre seam can be finger pressed open, And as mentioned, the butt end of the crotch can now be joined and stitched. The main body is now just missing the leg pieces, which we can close in along their side seam. The higher side of this leg should be oriented towards the front of the body, and in order to attach them, I recommend turning the leg right side out and pushing it inside the body. With lots of snips again around the seam allowance, I start joining up my alignment marks from the side seam. This is another tricky join with so many pins, and is definitely one that I chose to baste stitch before taking to the machine. I laid the body down like this and stitched it with the leg side facing up, turning the body around as I progressed. I can now pull the leg out from the body and repeat the same process for the other side. And that completes the main construction of our manly mannequin. I turn him right side out through one of the leg openings and admire my handiwork, taking note that I can see the top and bottom of the port stand that I marked earlier. I've been careful not to press anything with my iron yet, because I didn't want to lose any of my heat erasable pen alignment markers. Now, it's time to cut out these circle shapes, and I'll show you how I plan to mount my mannequin as well. One of my thigh pieces has a hole in the centre, which I plan to put a wooden dowel through. I trace the thigh circle onto light cardboard, then use the neck template to draw another circle roughly in the centre. I cut out this donut shape and trace a thigh circle onto the back of the same cotton fabric, leaving plenty of seam allowance round the outside. In the middle of this circle, I draw a little square and then cut out this piece. I trace another thigh circle with no seam allowance and layer this on the right side of our previous circle, holding it up to the light to get it lined up properly. You can then machine or hand stitch all the way around this little square that I've drawn here. And next I'm going to cut an X into the middle of this little square, getting close to, but being careful not to cut, the stitches. I can then turn the smaller circle through this hole to the other side, and then can thread my cardboard donut between these two fabric pieces, giving me a sturdy end cap for the thigh. To finish it off, I just sew a running stitch around the outside of the seam allowance and pull to gather it in. Once gathered, I tighten and knot the end of the thread and lay the disc aside for now. The other thigh, arms and neck are also simply cut from card and wrapped in fabric in the same way, but minus the hole. Before I start stuffing the mannequin with filling, I test position my wooden dowel in the body, having it hit the top of the shoulder and just make sure everything's going to fit. My dowel is 50 centimeters long and 6 millimeters wide. Before stuffing, I like to turn in and baste stitch the seam allowance from the neck, arm and thigh openings. Here they're all turned in and hand stitched, and now I'll replace the wood dowel and start stuffing around it. I'm careful to add small pieces at a time, making sure that as I stuff him, the dowel remains in position. I take care to push stuffing into all of his various bulges, the crotch, butt and chest, We don't want any empty or floppy areas. This is where my dowel is sitting at the moment, and I feel like the legs are pushing outwards too much now. So I'm going to use some doubled up thread and will anchor it to the seam allowance inside the inner leg, before passing the needle back and forth across the crotch to pull it in a little tighter, anchoring and knotting it again to the seam allowance on the other side. That little stitch definitely helps to position the legs where I want them. Finally, I double check the measurements against my own Smart Doll Guy's to see if any alterations need to be made before he's finished. Depending on your own fabric and results, you might want to use that same soft toy sculpture technique to pull some of his seams in together with thread, like I just did with the crotch. Passing the thread from seam to seam inside the body and pulling tight can help you tighten up the body if it's stretched out too much. I'm very happy with my measurements again though, so I move on to using a ladder stitch to join on each of the discs to the ends of his limbs. If you're a little worried that the wooden dowel will get pulled out, you could add a little hot glue around the base of the leg to prevent this. Before I finish up his stand, I use a little red thread to highlight the stand port markings I made. If, like me, you used a heat erasable pen and can still see some of your pen markings through the fabric, use a hairdryer or a small heat gun now to warm the surface of the fabric, and all of these markings will disappear. Drum roll please! I used Blender to design my own mannequin base. It's 3D printed and is offset and sized perfectly to fit my 6mm wooden dowel. I've used wooden log slices as bases before. You can get pretty creative with this bit. I'm so delighted. What a perfect way to finish off this guy. I'm really looking forward to using this mannequin to pattern some special clothes for my 2 Smart Doll Guys. Did you all know that I have 2 of them? No? I also have a green peach body and a green pear body kit. I don't share all of my unboxings. Sometimes my dolls are just for me to enjoy. Today's sewing pattern is now available as a printable PDF download over at bethramsden.com. You'll find links below for the pattern and to my Patreon page, where you could be seeing behind the scenes stuff and getting freebies. Please let me welcome my newest supporter there, Stephanie Wormley. Thanks to all my Patreon members for your support there. And thank you all for watching today. I do hope you enjoyed this slightly more complex version of my dressmaking mannequin series. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, so please don't be shy and leave me a message and a like on the video if you enjoyed it. Thanks again, happy sewing, and I'll see you next time. Bye!